welcome back to the show. Today we're with Eunike Ventures. Eunike Ventures is a global energy platform for technology acceleration, adoption, and commercialization. And they seek innovative technologies that transcend across the entire spectrum of the energy value chain. I'm here with Amy, the co-founders, Amy and Thomas Henry. Amy Henry is the CEO, and Thomas Henry is Thomas. He's the non-executive board member, but I know partner in crime. Tell us a little bit more about what it means to work with Eunike Ventures.
I'll start off, and then Thomas can kind of join in. When we started this, it was really from the entrepreneur standpoint, because we saw this was when Houston was at an early stage with their innovation ecosystem. You really only had Houston Technology Center and Station Houston here in Houston. And we saw, really some, I'll call diamonds in the rough, right? And they were kind of stuck on this hamster wheel. So they were being taught how to pitch to VCs and angels. And so they would ask, what's your recurring revenue? And they would say, well, I don't have any. Well, you need to go out and go get some proof of concepts and pilots. And so some of them would get those pilots with the customer if they were lucky. They weren't paid for them. And then the way the oil and gas industry traditionally worked was you couldn't share the company's name. So they would then go back to the investor and say, oh, I have some revenue. Well, who is it with? Well, I can't tell you, right? So they were caught in this quandary. So we said, listen, is there a way that we can get some very open-minded companies, and we started with Statoil, which is now Equinor, that will work with us on a more open innovation mindset, right? Maybe starting an MVP. Can we get them to pay for field trials, keep their IP whole? Share results with other like-minded energy companies so that they at least have an earlier springboard of customers. So, that's how we started working is with companies that were at the pilot, close to piloting stage, and we worked globally. But now I'll let Thomas take over here. And then we started working with earlier and earlier companies. So we really run the gamut in terms of maturity of these companies, all the way from an idea all the way up through even Series C and Series D companies.
Yeah. So again, without sounding to repeat what Amy said, the focus was around pilots. Again, technologies that helped companies solve a pain point. So we always started with what were the key pain points that they were looking for. So when we mapped out technologies that we were supposed to search for, it was all about solving the pain points that the organizations were looking to. And of course, initially it was very, how shall I say, oil and gas focused, but more importantly, they transitioned to the clean tech and energy type solutions.
One of the things that I heard you pick up on is getting the pilot, a referenceable pilot, is such an inflection point for an early stage company. And the ethos in traditional energy was not to let that information be public for some reason, for good reasons, I'm sure. And part of accelerating the adoption of new technology requires you to say, I have sold it to someone and they liked it. And it's an interesting transformation that you're helping facilitate here in Houston, and I think that's great work. Tell us a little bit about, I guess, some of the success stories or some companies you've worked with recently where you've gotten through kind of your process.
Okay.
You want to start off?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I would say the first company we actually, everyone knows that, most people know that we worked with was Nesh, right? And that was the very first company that we had publicized. And so, and I think it's a good story for people to understand all the dynamics that have to come into play. So Nesh was at the time, they were focusing on bot technology. And they were two gentlemen from Schlumberger, right, who had this idea, couldn't we make things a bit easier, and how can we bring more talented people into energy, because we all use different software, and sometimes companies won't hire someone because they don't know a particular software. So we really love the concept, and Equinor really liked them. And so they had managed to secure some potential early funding from a Dallas early stage VC. But they said, okay, we'll look about investing into you, Nesh, but what we'd like to see is you come up with a paid pilot, right? And at the same time, Equinor really liked the technology, and then we did a health check on them and a deep dive on their whole technology roadmap. And Equinor says, I'd like to be able to run them through the first company for North America for the loop funding program, which is very similar to Shell Game Changer and Chevron Catalyst. It's a non-dilutive equity kind of grant funding for the company. And if they're successful, it ends up being kind of like a royalty, later on in their ramp up. So they said, okay, Equinor says, I want to run them through the loop funding. Now, and then Hess said, well, listen, if you do that, I want to look at doing some field trials, right? So all of these three things kind of had to happen because Equinor then said, also for the loop funding, we want to see you have VC money from outside the industry, which was your Dallas, VC. So, it was pushing all of these. And then they had a series of different types of pilots with Hess and Equinor. And then from that, that validation of having those company names, they've gone on to work with outside of the energy industry. They've worked for Shell. They've done stuff for BASF. I mean, I can't name all the companies they've worked with now. You're talking 15 to 20 companies. So that really was, and then they've raised additional funding successfully since then. So it provided that early springboard of having both Equinor and Hess and others, investing money, validating it through POCs. They did joint white papers that were published to the industry. So I think they're a great, one that we can share that everyone kind of can understand.
Yeah. I mean, not all of it is like successful, like what we consider as niche, because from a digital technology point of view, it's easier to develop the field trials and what we call the business case. But for the hard science, correct, hard science type technologies, to test the technology, you really need to develop the business case within what we call the asset team. Because again, hard science technologies needs to be implemented within the asset itself. And that requires a lot of, how shall I say, various stakeholders being involved. And it's not a clear forward, how shall I say, submission of I will be doing the pilot. So we got a lot of the companies up to the business case, but then implementing and getting the pilots was much harder than we thought because it was actually, impinging on their operations, safety, and that could be a hurdle that, maybe need to circumvent somehow.
So I'll just quickly, there's different things. So when we talk about piloting real quick, and we even had this discussion with operators is how do you get away from this, old standard view of piloting? What does that mean exactly? So sometimes we would do a health check and kind of a quick due diligence on the company, but then we would we said, well, maybe upstream's not the best place to start. Sometimes they may be referred to industry association, like with Hess, it was an iPipe association. We work with utility-backed accelerators where we believe their traction would start a lot faster and they can start pilots there. We keep them in view. Correct. During COVID, we did several bench trials, right, with companies. And then there's other ones where we've just completely broken up their stack, their technology stack, and tested different aspects. So it's not the traditional, I'm going out and I'm doing a field trial for one company.
Yeah.
Right.
So the intent is to actually define what your business case. Very often, startups can be dogmatic about what their technology is able to solve and not actually pivot when and where is required. So what we try to do is actually open up the entire horizon. So if let's say, for example, if you're looking at one vertical like the oil and gas or the energy vertical, what other verticals can you actually implement your technology in? And that's a discussion that you need with people who have got experience that span the entire spectrum. And that provides their help in getting parallel pilots.
So this is really interesting to me because I have heard from lots of startups that pilots are the number one challenge facing right now. And that sounds like this is exactly what we need here in Houston because our ecosystem is different and it's growing and it has to grow really fast because we are facing a global challenge. And you guys say you are a first of its kind global energy venture builder. Your name, Eunike, right? Explain to me what you guys do that is different. Like, are you a fund? Are you what is it that differentiates you and the companies that you look for and how you are helping them?
This is always a good question. I'll go to something. I had to develop some collaterals actually a few weeks ago for another major energy company. And so I'd been working with this company, and she said, "You've really helped me. I found her." And so she was calling us the energy whisperers, right? And I thought it's so funny. But I said, it really is true, because we work on both sides of the equation, right? Both from the entrepreneur, but we also work with the energy companies, right? So energy companies obviously are looking in it. We work with them every year. What's the global technology? So we're not looking for technologies that Amy and Thomas think are good. It's collectively, as an industry, these are the areas that they're focusing on technologies. Now, some maybe agree and focus on hydrogen together. Others may say, no, we want you to kind of work with us standalone. Now, today, a lot of times when we're working with these energy companies, they're coming with more earlier stage funding, right? So it's really looking and working with, identifying these companies, are they a right fit, along with our energy companies, assessing a snapshot of where they're at. And then if they like it, then we'll either do this with them, or we'll do it as a standalone basis, that due diligence process. And that report is then provided to both. And then the energy company then will run that up through their investment committee. Now, on the other hand, I also am very big advocate and champion about early stage investing. So I sit on the board of TIE, which is the Indus Entrepreneurs Network, and that's a nonprofit, and it's a global organization. We're in 16 countries. Mm-hmm. Some of our chapters have VCs, and some do not. So I work both in Houston and Dallas. So we look at this as, not only do we provide early stage investing, at least for Houston, we'll sign safe notes. We don't set up hurdles, because also part of our mission is, how do we create that future pathways for future entrepreneurs? We look to see in our community, is there any value that we can have? Because a lot of our community are either entrepreneurs or they're retired professionals linked to various industries, right? So how can we help accelerate these companies at the same time providing them early seed capital? So that's another way. So we are working more globally. As a TIE, I also sit along with Houston Angel Network, mm-hmm. and we're getting more and more, I'll say, regional collaboration and cooperation with other angel groups coming from California, kind of Southwest, New Mexico, all the way down to the southern area that we have. So it takes a lot of skill sets about how do you find the right early stage investor for this company based on what they want to do. How do you find the right energy partner, mm-hmm. right? And sometimes they're running parallel strategies. They might want to tackle the energy industry, and they maybe want to tackle the manufacturing industry at the same time. So how do we work both ends of that spectrum? And I'll let Thomas.
So it's a little bit like matchmaking, maybe, right?
Yeah, but you're also working with them, kind of rolling up the sleeves mm-hmm. and working in the trenches with them. Yeah.
I want to come back to a point where you mentioned about, there is a lack of, how shall I say, unity across the energy players in trying to say, hey, I've tried a pilot, come and share, correct? So when we initially formed Eunike Ventures and formed this alliance, it was not a cup of tea for all companies, correct? Where they felt that competition meant I need to curtail what people see and what I'm trying, versus some who has got very wide mindset. So I still like to quote what Rob Fast, who's the CTO for Hess, and he said, "A rising tide raises all ships." Mm-hmm. And he said, this so-called alliance and sharing of technologies requires a very different mindset coming out from what we call chief technology officers, because the competition is not in trying to understand what the technology does for you, but in the application of the technology, because every organization will need to fill a gap which is very different. So your competitive edge is not knowing about the technology, but it's about the application of the technology. So again, that was kind of important when we set up Eunike Ventures.
Well, and I think just recently, and I think we haven't really talked about this publicly a lot, just because it's still in infancy stages, because we are from the industry. Most of us have 30, some 40 years of experience. But because we wear both hats, we've got the DNA from the energy, right? We also understand and know what it's like to walk in the shoes of the entrepreneurs. So from an energy company perspective, we are, in essence, let's think of it, easiest way to explain to people as an extension mm-hmm. of the company. And then they're looking to, how do I do things differently? How can I learn from others? How do you reduce that internal bias? So, we were throwing ideas last year. We did a closed round door table amongst a lot of the large players and a lot of energy companies people know. People were very open and talked about their challenges. Of course, we know a lot what they are, right? But are they in the mindset to really tackle these? So one that we're looking at is technology adoption. So is there a way that we can create a new model in which we can, amongst a smaller subset of companies, get their customer requirements up front, but then they have to let it go. Mm-hmm. So it's like funding a field trial or a POC, but it's very directed. So we take all of those collective user requirements from an energy company instead of an entrepreneur going to each one in a parallel process. Then we design a more collective, right, pilot or validation, and they may look at different aspects of the technology. And then we, as kind of the management of this technology validation, then we bring everyone together and discuss it instead of them going internally to each company. And that adoption period for some at a minimum extends that adoption within their own companies by 2 to 3 years. Mm-hmm. Then if you take hard tech, right, it's probably more like 4 to 5 years.
Yeah. I think this is something I did not appreciate about the energy industry until I came to Houston, was how collaborative it is on a technical level. Because in many ways, there are a lot of challenges that are hard in the field, but a lot of the companies have very similar challenges, and they come together and share in a relatively public or private way in terms of the roundtable. These are the challenges we're facing. This is kind of the rank order of what we need to address. And I didn't appreciate that until I went to the SPE conferences and OTC and looking at joint industry programs. This is the thing the industry does well, because we have to do big stuff. And I don't think it's necessarily obvious to innovators on the coasts that there are mechanisms for the technologists to come together and say, this is what we need. And then you guys have pulled this together and said, okay, now let's go find the technologies that solve that need in a very deliberate way, because you are looking and out there. And I see you guys out there meeting the founders in and around Houston. And so there's some pieces of this that have been built up in the way the energy industry works, but I appreciate the unique twist you've brought in to really go out and deliberately identify the technologists and not just find them, but do a health check and prepare them to really engage with these big corporates.
Yeah. And sometimes we actually have to tell them the truth. I mean, so we'll see a few companies that are in the same space, and then we'll say, oh my God, could be a unicorn if we take slice A mixed with slice D of this company and slice C. And then we, in fact, actually try to make these collisions work and actually have the CEOs talk to each other and say, hey, can you look and joining forces and trying to develop this technology and present that as your so-called base case of value proposition, correct, to the oil gas.
Yeah, I just want to kind of tag on that. And I think it talks about our Houston ecosystem and innovation system that is, I call it, in the early maturation cycle. We're at the very early stage. And a lot of people like to say that, okay, by us having these innovation systems that, in different pockets around town, that it's going to create collisions, right? Mm-hmm. I don't agree with that. Yeah, I think it's a great way for people to know about one another. It's a great way to develop that network, and interaction. And I've talked even with TMC about this on the medical side, because really energy is really more like biotech these days, really about our lifeblood. And they say the same thing. We have to force these collisions. Right. They just don't naturally come. Yeah, there's a few exceptions to that where you have, entrepreneurs that are like serial connectors and very collaborative, and they may meet one another and they may be able to just spot it right away and just naturally come together. They're like the 1%, right? All the other ones have to be kind of pushed together and talk about what they don't see. Because when you're in your tech and building this out, you're very, deep in looking at what you're trying to do. You're not worried about everyone else, that's out there.
That's funny. We were talking about this a little bit just a little while ago. Like the difference between being an introvert and an extrovert in this industry. and the serial networkers, right? The folks that are just at it all the time. And that's a full-time job, right? I am a introvert and I see those people and I am like just exhausted looking at them. And then for a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of founders that are in the tech, right? Like they live and they breathe in their spreadsheets, in their computers, in their labs, and getting out in front of people is also exhausting and challenging because they're so focused on what they're doing, which is changing the way we make energy, right? So we need folks like you help making those collisions, making it easier for them. But then also, are collisions enough? Right?
No.
Like, and collisions, that's at best what managed chaos, right? Things might miss when you're just throwing things back and forth.
Yeah, and I really thought about this, and it really was earlier this year. Because I kept on saying, why does everyone say energy companies aren't innovative, right? And of course, a lot of the technologies we look for outside of the energy industry, right, is we look for that connectivity and application, especially when you talk about, clean energy and what the whole world needs. But, after taking a step back and saying, okay, really, it's fair, right? I would say energy are great technology development, right? Okay. And that's long lead. And energy has been innovative in coming up with new ways of doing things, but it's that lead time. And there's lots of reasons why. From an HSE, you've got management change, many, many reasons. Now, innovators, right, are a different mindset. And so now you're asking the energy to become rapid innovators, right? And those are completely different mindsets. And then some of the things you're talking about, I think we're also then, all of us are innovators are one type of, these are very deep tech. These are the generation. Most innovators are not entrepreneurs, right? They aren't. There's very few people that can do both. And so the question is, are we asking this new breed and new generation of innovators and entrepreneurs to do too much? I mean, I think we are. You've got to be great at a connector, right? You've got to be great at continually and rapidly developing your tech. You've got to develop all of these relationships with your customers. Now you've got to be an expert at storytelling, right? Because to get investment dollars, you have to be able to be a great storyteller. 99% of people are terrible at storytelling, right? That's not why they're doing what they're doing. And, we're expecting to do all of these things.
Now you have to be a policy expert as well,
And
because stuff is changing every single day and you're getting all of these questions.
And in fact, we have actually advised companies where the CEO was actually the inventor or the main founder, correct? And then say you probably need to be a CTO at best and let somebody else take a CEO role where he's able to concentrate on everything that matters, correct? The storytelling. And sometimes it's hard. I mean, they because they don't want to relinquish their baby and say, hey, let somebody else take care of it, somebody from external.
And even CTO sometimes is a marketing role.
Yeah.
Right? As much as it is a technology development role. And not everyone appreciates that shift you have to make. That's right. And very often, because they become so, using the same word, dogmatic about their technology, it's they think that it's only solving an X rather than, a three-dimensional problem. So to get them to be comfortable outside the box, they say, well, I don't know whether I'm a platform technology or whether I'm a one-type technology. So getting them comfortable is also, because most of them are with PhDs and have a different mindset.
I want to go back to something that you said, Amy, about is the energy industry innovative or not? And you said you thought about this. And I know that I want to say, yes, it is. But then I also find myself saying, no, it's not, or it's definitely not as innovative as it should be, as fast as it should be. But then you go back and you think about when we talk about energy and the companies that we're talking about and the size that they're enormous, that energy is something that we often think about as just like a light switch and we turn on and off, and it has to be there. It is too big to fail in a lot of ways. But then we're talking about new technology that's disruptive, and pilots, especially, most pilots fail, right? We want them to fail. Otherwise, you don't go through the iterative process. And I think that goes back to that challenge of you've got the biggest companies on the planet sometimes that are so incredibly risk averse because they are supposed to be providing something that is incredibly safe and incredibly reliable. How do you see the companies like balancing that out? Like, how do you get companies that shouldn't be failing, purposely trying things, telling them we know this might not work?
I mean, Shell Game Changer is one very good example, correct? I mean, you worked with Shell Technology Ventures, and I've been involved with Shell Game Changer. I mean, they had that, how shall I say, DNA of innovation a long time. And Shell Game Changer started, 20, 30 years back.
About 20, 30. And it was, people don't know, this was co-developed with Silicon Valley, right?
Yes.
So a lot of people don't know the story. So this was not internally developed within energy. You know, Shell, I think, was at that time, right, was really insightful and say, you know, we're great at internal innovation, but how do we bring external within and then build that DNA in our people?
And if you think about it, I mean, how they go about actually providing the funding for technologies that is so varied, correct? Everything from new energies to the typical traditional oil and gas. But again, the implementation and the pilot requires a lot of, shall I say, due diligence, correct? Because the amount of capital expenditure, like you say, safety involved in implementing a certain technology, it's not straightforward, correct? I mean, it is a tortuous path. And that's where people might think, oh, it's such a long time to adopt. No, because they're operating in a different type of realm as opposed to.
Well, and I think it's also telling people, okay, listen, energy companies are not early adopters. Okay, we need to kind of stop kidding ourselves. And sometimes we have questions on velocity, right? But we just keep on having some of the same discussions. Your velocity is only good as your uptake, and your uptake takes a really long time. It's also the conversation of getting more energy companies to understand really the life of these companies unless they get early stage capital, right? You can't come back 7 months later and say, oh, I'm interested now, right? I've had time internally. Okay, so people may not know. I mean, the average energy company, it takes 29 to 30 touch point conversations at a minimum internally to discuss a technology. So it's how do they move faster, because these companies are going to die. So my concern is, number one, we're going to see some really good ideas die off because of this. I think secondly, majority of these companies are not going to come from energy. So if we don't figure out a better way to work this issue, they are naturally going to go and build out in other verticals, right? So and they need to have their footprint to a certain extent on what they need from those technologies. So that's only going to extend. So I think beginning of this year, I think the IEA said we were only on point for the technology development that we needed to do. If you looked at that time, I think COP26 was like 2%.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how far behind we are. So, yeah.
So as we talk about, touch on climate a little bit, it's getting more complicated because I assume carbon is now entering the calculus. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing and hearing from your partners. And we'll direct
Do you feel like, you know, we just finished COP27.
Yes.
Is the impact of climate change pushing the companies you work with forward?
Well, I mean, I think for the IOCs, or integrated oil companies, you know, the names everyone knows, your Shells, your BPs, Exxon, Chevron. So, I mean, I started Shell in probably the mid-90s. I mean, and I think we, as an industry, have done really bad job at engaging and talking about our business. So we were measuring carbon intensity in our capital allocation the way we did this at Shell back in the 90s, right? So GHG emissions were measured. Of course, we determined many different facets of how we invest, but that was one big point, is we looked at what is our carbon footprint and how we measure this amongst all the projects and all the activities as Shell as a global company undertaking. So I think it's more bringing that up to the forefront, and then how do you have that discussion throughout the whole entire value chain. And now you have companies like Baker Hughes. They've set up Baker Hughes New Frontiers, which their sole focus is on technology and innovation, and actually providing some early stage investment dollars into hydrogen, carbon capture in other areas, and they're not looking to build and breed other Baker Hughes companies, but how do we help and participate in this? Yeah, for these new markets that are going to be developed.
Yeah. No, what we see from the startup, so there is a bit more engagement, correct? I mean, as we mentioned, Eunike, when we first started, it was mainly focused on oil and gas, and then very quickly, energy transition and ESG has become what we call the transitory point between the typical oil and gas, ESG focus, and then energy transition, correct? Hydrogen and CCUS and the likes. So where the focus right now is actually ensuring we have got a good ESG platform, because that is the low-hanging fruit. If you want to talk about carbon capture, you want to talk about reduction of the carbon footprint, ESG is the lowest hanging fruit. So the focus has been on that. So if you take a look at all the startups, it's very interesting that their slide deck all starts off with, we can reduce carbon footprint. I mean, okay, hold on. What are you selling again? But it's a good way of getting them to think about how exactly their technology will reduce carbon footprint. So with that, how shall I say, mindset within the startups, thinking about that helps quite a bit.
Well, I think this happened just probably about 2, maybe 3 weeks ago. I was at an Energy Council kind of a capital event, and I like to go and hear what some of the mid caps are doing, because some people, they're highly backed by PE and capital markets, so they're also feeling the pressure. Right, because even some of their financiers have dropped them, and they've had to find new backing and from all of these pressures. But I always like to listen to Toby Rice from EQT. I mean, and a lot of veterans find him a very dynamic person. But I think one important thing that he said, which I brought this up to Canada when I was up at Canada. I said, I know Canada feels like they're more advanced than the U.S. is on some of these things. But I said, we have our mid-caps. We had Toby Rice's leadership saying we need to start looking beyond our borders when we talk about our industry, which is really the first time, that I've really heard them say this, right? And then at the same time, which I thought was very interesting, and we're talking about scope 1 and 2, and, everyone said it's a necessity. But really looking beyond scope 3 and really focusing on scope 4. What are we doing to create avoidance, right? So I think you see a lot of the mid-cap operators really stepping up to the game, right? And I think, looking beyond our borders, looking at this from a more global context is very refreshing. So I think they get this. And I think, you're going to hear more forward, engagement, with the broader community going forward.
Yeah. So to go the other direction, you get a little more local. What are you most proud of in terms of the Houston innovation ecosystem today?
I think for me, it's the establishment of organizations like presence of Greentown Labs, the ION. RISE does a really good job with the so-called cohorts and the carbon, which is just started. I think all of that is needed. I would like to see more involvement from what we call the international oil companies. What we have not seen in Houston actually is the presence of utility type companies getting involved, because a lot of the technologies we look at is actually focused on lower hanging fruits, where you talk about solar, you talk about batteries. You need to get them involved, because very often the IOCs, there is very limited span of how shall I say, involvement in that. But the utility need to buck up, and we have not seen much in terms of utility players.
No, I think that's the lack thereof. And this talks about how do you drive those conversations throughout that whole value chain, right? Not just upstream, not just midstream, downstream, all the way through the utility. So, I think we would like to see more utility engagement. I think it's great that people are sponsoring and actually being visible and sponsoring the development and planting those seeds, right? I think that's one piece. But the other piece that's deeply needed is active participation, right? Really putting skin in the game, really. It's one thing to hold office hours and chat with a startup, but what are you trying to do to kind of help them? Maybe you don't have to do anything, but how can you connect them with someone that might be able to take them to that next step of what they're looking for?
So I agree with you completely that we need more utility players, because just about every startup in Houston has a utility component at some point in time. And that the Texas utility grid and regulatory structure is incredibly complex. An average startup doesn't have that level of expertise on top of their technological expertise. And so they need like a Sherpa to help understand how and where to go. And we don't necessarily have that yet right now. But also I think, or I see it as kind of traditional energy. You have oil and gas, and then you have electricity, and they don't necessarily really talk together, although they are connected. And that as climate and the energy transition moves forward, you see the electrification of everything, that buildings start being electricity, transportation starts being electric. And so it needs to be less siloed. You need to have all of the companies coming together. But I see that from if you were to write a children's book about energy in the future, it sounds quite simple. And you're like, oh, everything's connected and everything just plugs in. But you have historic and huge companies. Getting them to actually work together is much more complicated.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's deciding kind of what is the right business model. This looks at your energy distribution and your energy management, right? So, for some of these companies, even Baker, Shell, all the major, players you can think of are interested in these technologies, right? But then their business models for some of these companies will be via a PPA, a purchase power agreement. Well, that has to deal with the utility industry. But across that value chain, we really need to start looking at, is that the right business model and agreement, right, for that whole end-to-end system, and where those new markets are going to be developed. Yeah. So in some ways, they're developing their business with a business and commercial model that may not be the right mechanism, right? And that's going to have to be a lot of rework.
Yeah, Amy, you might want to talk to them about one of the companies that we're helping, Electric Fish, in getting traction, and EV charging company, in trying to get pilots or trying to get traction within Texas.
Yeah, I mean, most people saw them. I met them at NREL. So you have to really work early. So, NREL it's one of government labs, but it's also Shell's been investing there. Chevron's got their venture studios there. It's an industry growth forum. So I mentored them and worked with them. And then we further worked with them through our Energy Next program. But everyone saw them, they thought EV, but they were an energy distribution company, really, truly at the end of the day. So, it could be as they're developing, a charging station within your neighborhood, right? It's almost a microgrid concept. So they've gone through all sorts of great tech stars, and Lacey and a few others, but now they've got some pilots now with, I believe, up and coming Equinor and BP. Yeah. But it's and I also think that they're associated with Greentown Labs now too as well.
So that is one of the companies that we've been working with, and in fact, they would not have got the exposure to the oil and gas type players if they did not go through our Energy Next program. But more importantly, trying to navigate, like you mentioned about, the Texas, where, you need that support system, and you need the utility to be part of the solution of trying to get new technology implemented. They might be able to provide that field trials and the testing base.
Oh, so this will make it local and things. And now you reminded me what they said. So they're very young, right? These are young entrepreneurs. And they called me up and they said, we were reading this stuff about Texas, because they have this Silicon Valley, this Texas oil and gas view. Maybe we shouldn't have not applied to the Rice Clean Tech Accelerator, turned it down. We understand this is going to be a huge hydrogen hub, and I'm like, where have you guys been? They do trips down to Houston. They have conversations with their energy companies. I said, yes, of course it is, right? So it's how do you break down some of these barriers, right? When you have technology being developed, right, more outside of Texas. We're not there yet to really get, have a lot of these innovators in Texas yet, let alone Houston. But, they're missing out on some of this dialogue that's happening. I said, you've heard about those billions of dollars of these hydrogen hubs that are going to be set up down there? I said, oh yeah, we just found out about it, right? So somehow that messaging is not getting out there.
Absolutely. And that is part of why we are here today, because there is this skepticism a lot of times about Houston and about Texas and about climate and energy transition. And is it real and is it happening? And some folks say, I don't want to deal with it, right? There are other places we can go. And if we only put clean technology in certain parts of the country, we will never meet our goals. There's a huge equity issue there, right? And Texas, we are the energy capital of the world. We need those young minds and new ideas here to help spark innovation within the companies that we have, which you guys know because this is what you're doing every day. And I'm super curious because you are talking about taking EV companies and like climate tech and partnering them, like introducing them to fossil fuel companies. So a lot of folks think that would just can never happen. But that has to happen, right? Like talk about that and why to those folks that were in, I'm going to assume Silicon Valley, California, like why is that a benefit in this case?
I'll let you get off this time.
Okay, really? Okay. So why is the benefit? I mean, again, we take it for granted, correct? I mean, that it has to happen. But for us, we see it as a natural. I mean, because we have been involved with the whole value chain, everything from what we call the oil production to the utility. So for us, it was a natural fit to understand where they are coming from and basically placing them.
I'll give an example because people don't really, some may not, have the long history and understanding of I'll say, the majors or integrated oil companies. So when I was with Shell, this is back in 2004, 2005, we had renewables portfolio. We had solar, we had wind, we had all of this, right? And on a continual basis, Shell and others, they partner and work with companies like a Mitsubishi. Well, that's a car manufacturing company, right? Because in the long game, as you look at, things like LNG and floating LNG, you have to look at for these commodities and different ways of how they're handled, right? How do you transport them, right? If I want to ship it, or if I'm making liquefied natural gas, and I might need a regas terminal facility. This is heavy infrastructure and transportation. And so they have to work from shipping with ship companies. They have to work with auto manufacturers because what's going to happen is whatever that product that's going to be developed or used has to be built within the infrastructure of like a car. Right. So I think people's viewpoint is, okay, you just produce oil and gas, somehow it gets processed, it goes to market. I get it. I fill my car up. Right. But I think, and I even talk about more, we need to talk broader, like even like energy poverty, right? To really get people to fully understand what do we mean when we say energy? The touch points is everywhere from your roads, right? The asphalt, right? It goes to the schools and that are built and education. We have universities saying, well, how do I develop my workforce? What kind of workforce does energy need me to build for the future? So this is just so wide. And I think people just have this, certain kind of siloed viewpoint of what oil and gas companies are and do. And I think once you kind of get them to have a bit of a collision and connect, then that kind of widens that understanding of where their technology could be applied. And it actually can accelerate, especially for some of these companies that are mission-based, right? They're very mission-based companies.
I mean, that's why I said, it's second nature to us because we have been in the system for such a long time. But is it something that needs to happen in Houston ecosystem, like almost like a re-education, so there are many different pockets, correct? You have the Greater Houston Partnership that is part of energy transition, and then you've got the Climate Action Plan that is part of the Houston mayors, and then you've got I think Harris County has got another climate action. So all of them have got pockets of knowledge, but do they actually sing from the same song sheet? And advertising and getting the message across is required. I mean, like you said, not many people know the hydrogen hub and Houston is center of energy excellence, correct?
Yeah.
What I want to
Getting
say.
folks to sing at all. That was a battle. Getting them to sing together, it's happening, but is it happening as fast as possible? And what I think is really important, and you guys talked about this, is that you can't leave players out, right? That everybody has to do as much as they can, as fast as they can. And absolutely there is an argument to say, are the oil and gas companies doing as much as they can, as fast as they can? But also everybody has a role to play. And to the folks that are in other parts of the country that say, I wouldn't come to Houston, or maybe I should have applied, right?
Yeah.
That there is so much opportunity here, and that there are people like y'all working to make these things happen is so important.
Well, I think there's one key thing we really don't talk about enough. I mean, people do talk about it, but even from a Shell and Shell Game Chamber, we used to say kind of necessity is the mother of innovation, right? So you really don't innovate and push things until you're literally forced to. But I think another big driver is going to be the change in workforce, which is going to be happening in 2025. So when I spoke at OTC, they asked us to do polls and to see who in the audience knew about this big workforce change. Very few people, right? I mean, it's going to be a major. Your baby boomers are going to be like 3%. Right. This is going to be at like 60, 70% of your Gen Y, Gen Z, your millennials. And that is going to be a driving force. But the other aspect to it, so they're very pro innovation. They're ready to try new things. They're also potentially the new group of innovators too that this country is going to have. But at the same time, you have to worry about knowledge management, right? And leaving these companies. So you still need who's going to be help infusing some of this knowledge and kind of framework for these younger people.
I would love to double click into that, except that we're running low on time. And I think importantly, how do potential partners find you? And then do you find startups, or do the startups find you?
So actually, the hard work is we actually go and find startups. So I'm part of the Israel Mass Challenge mentor. So I'm become a mentor for the Rise, a mentor for what do you call it, Generator. So we put our feelers out, and it's not just locally; it's international. So I try to attend all the various events. And look for technology. So if you take a look at our the bridges that we have built, correct? We have built the technology bridge with Canada, built it with France. We helped Business France screen through companies and bring companies over here. We have got a bridge with Israel, Israel Innovation Authority. And where else, Amy, if I'm mistaken? Norway, yes, exactly, Norway. But sadly, do you know that the Norwegian consulate is closing?
I was going to talk about this.
Okay.
Please tell us.
Okay, well, so I attended last week an event, and I was telling Hilda, why are they closing? She said, I know why they're closing. Well, I know now, but I don't know whether we need to edit it or the reason. I mean, it just didn't feel comfortable with Houston. So they saw Houston as, we do oil and gas in our backyard. Are we really serious about energy transition? So something like that, is, so are we advertising right?
I think that's a huge moment that all of Houston should look at, because Norway is such a partner. They literally are my neighbors. Many of the folks from the Norwegian consulate have corporate housing, like literally in my apartment complex. So they are my neighbors, and this was a huge thing. But if we think about it on an international scale, like what is the message we're putting out? And that is why we need to be talking about things like we're talking about today.
That's right. So they may be misinformed, correct? I mean, but to be fair, it's a lot of it is the decisions are made in Norway, and they have got certain, how shall I say, issues with Houston, and like I said, are we sending the right messages, and how do we attract?
Well, and I think we work outside of just the energy vertical. So we look, We work across the country looking at med tech, biotech. I mean, the whole insurance, fintech, ag tech, right? And then also I think one key thing that Houston needs to also then realize as they're building this ecosystem, and this is a global issue with the ecosystems. Most of the companies that we meet and actually eventually work with, a lot of them are off-grid technologies, right? You won't see them in an innovation ecosystem, right? And so, trust is a big factor for them. So it's usually word of mouth through other entrepreneurs of how we find these companies. So it's just, people know who you are. Your name gets passed around. So this is, I would say, where we sometimes really find the really interesting and good tech.
And sometimes we actually create the companies where we, I'll give you a good example. So Mentor Mass Challenge, they had, just before COVID, they had an event. And I saw a company and I said, hey, I like your technology, but can you put it underwater? And he went back and actually did that. And he did some Sandia studies, some CFD, computational fluid dynamic type studies. And he came up and he said, oh, then I said, okay, why don't you fill up what we call Unike's pitch deck on a page, correct? And we brought it to our alliance partners and they say, oh, very interesting technology. Lovely. So, because it was at TRL 0, he's just thinking about it. And he went and applied to DOE, but we sent a letter on behalf of the alliance partner saying this technology would be adopted or would be, how shall I say, piloted if look at it once. And he got funding of $2 million from DOE.
Fantastic.
So DOE also needs, they will support technologies, but they need that industry to validate the applicability. And, they don't want to put money on what they call university type, R&D, typical R&D, but you want to make sure that there's application.
And so kind of a parting thought, and what I'm hearing is industry is really the partner here for bringing technology to market. And they can be a strong voice in advocating for funding, not just from themselves, but from government, from angel investors. And it's never too early to get started talking to them.
Yes.
Yes, that's correct, right? And angels were, as of Q3, they were the only group of investors who did not decrease their investment.
Oh, interesting.
So they held strong. And this is why it's kind of concerning, but you have growth capital now trying to jump over and then try to get into early stage capital. But yeah, your angel investors have pretty well held strong this year.
Okay.
I love it. Amy, Thomas, thank you so much. Our own personal energy whisperers. I hope you keep whispering. I hope you don't have to whisper in the future, right?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.